Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book, where we delve into the pivotal moments of history. In Season 09, Episode 05, we turn the pages of Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern World History to explore a period where the world stumbled from fragile peace into devastating global conflict. Our mission today is to unpack the critical years between 1933 and 1939, zeroing in on the aggressive actions of key nations and the often hesitant responses from other powers, ultimately leading us right to the brink of the Second World War.
It's a compelling journey, isn't it? And, the central question for this era is pretty profound. How did Europe, supposedly having learned such a bitter lesson from the First World War, find itself back on the precipice of another catastrophic conflict so quickly? It's truly remarkable how swiftly that Locarno spirit, that kind of post-WWII hope for lasting peace and cooperation just faded away.
Yeah, it really did. Let's delve into that. Our source pinpoints three aggressive powers that truly dominated the global stage during this period: Japan, Italy, and Germany. We should probably begin with Japan, the nation that really kicked off this era of open aggression. Their 1931 invasion of Manchuria feels like such a pivotal moment. What were the driving forces behind that move?
Well, the sources indicate Japan felt compelled to secure control of Manchuria. They saw it as an essential trade outlet. There was also a palpable fear of being economically marginalized by a strengthening China under Chiang Kai-shek. And look, we can't overlook this severe economic hardship they were grappling with because of the Great Depression. Japan already had deep historical involvement there, going back to the 1890s. Port Arthur control of the South Manchurian Railway after the war with Russia. By 31, they basically controlled the railway, much of the banking. To sort of legitimize it, they even tried establishing Manchukuo under Puyi, the last Chinese emperor. But as our source clearly states, this fooled nobody.
Right. And the wider implications of that aggression were profound, weren't they? This wasn't just some regional conflict. It was a global psychological test, really. How did the world respond to this blatant act of defiance?
Exactly. This incident provided a crucial blueprint for future aggressors. While the League of Nations did condemn Japan, its response proved to be, well, utterly ineffective in actually curbing their actions. This set a dangerous precedent. It sent a clear message to leaders like Hitler and Mussolini that international bodies, the whole concept of collective security, could be defied with little to no real consequence. They watched that failure very, very closely.
So with that ominous precedent set, let's turn our attention to Italy and Mussolini. He initially declared his aim to make Italy great, respected, and feared. But interestingly, his early foreign policy, say from 1923 to 1934, seemed a bit uncertain at times. It was largely marked by rivalry with France, especially over influence in the Mediterranean and the Balkans. He even, somewhat surprisingly, supported Chancellor Dollfuss against the Austrian Nazis and signed a non-aggression pact with the USSR in 1933.
Yeah, and one intriguing element here is the significant shift in Mussolini's approach after 1934. He went from being extremely suspicious of Hitler's ambitions regarding Austria. Initially he contemptuously dismissed Hitler as that mad little clown, to a sort of grudging admiration and ultimately a desire to imitate him. His perspective really changed as he became convinced there was more to gain from aligning with Germany than with Britain and France. A key turning point was the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in June 1935. This deal, made by Britain without even consulting its allies, effectively condoned German naval rearmament and profoundly convinced Mussolini of British cynicism and self-interest.
And that shift truly manifested with his invasion of Abyssinia, or Ethiopia, in October 1935. The source calls that a great turning point for Mussolini. What was he hoping to achieve there?
Well, his motives were multi-layered. Italy's existing East African colonies were largely unproductive, kind of disappointing economically. Plus, the country was struggling with the Great Depression. A victorious war, he believed, could divert public attention from internal troubles, maybe create new markets, and crucially, boost his sagging popularity by appealing to nationalist and colonialist feelings. It also offered a chance to avenge Italy's humiliating defeat at Adowa way back in 1896.
Thinking about the broader context then, what impact did the League of Nations response or lack thereof to Abyssinia have on this idea of collective security?
It was, quite frankly, disastrous. While the League condemned Italy and applied economic sanctions, these were critically undermined because they notably excluded banning the sale of essential resources like oil and coal. Things that would have actually crippled Italy's war machine. And then, the revelation of the secret Hoare-Laval Pact, this clandestine agreement between the British Foreign Secretary and French Prime Minister to secretly hand over a large chunk of Abyssinia to Italy. That completely discredited the very notion of collective security. It sparked huge public outrage. This entire debacle ultimately pushed Mussolini much closer to Hitler, who, very cannily, hadn't criticized the invasion or applied sanctions. It effectively sealed their alliance. After this, Mussolini just dropped his objections to a German takeover of Austria.
Right. Okay, now this next phase is particularly compelling. Hitler's calculated expansion. His aims, as laid out in our source, seemed remarkably clear from the start, didn't they? Dismantle the hated Versailles settlement, rebuild the German army, reclaim lost territories like the Saar and the Polish corridor, and unite all German-speaking peoples within the Reich. This meant annexing Austria, taking territory from Czechoslovakia, from Poland. Both had substantial German minorities. And beyond these immediate goals, he spoke of Lebensraum, living space, suggesting a need for more land. And his intense hatred of Jewish Bolshevism certainly pointed towards conquering Russia eventually.
And this raises a vital historical question, doesn't it? Was Hitler's grand plan a detailed, long-term blueprint for a major war right from the very beginning? Or was he more of a brilliant opportunist, just capitalizing on the mistakes and hesitancy of others? Historians have debated this at length. A.J.P. Taylor, for instance, controversially argued back in 1961 that Hitler never actually intended a major generalized war, at most, maybe a limited conflict with Poland. Taylor viewed Hitler as an opportunist who, got as far as he did because others did not know what to do with him. He even suggested Hitler's aims weren't entirely dissimilar to previous German rulers, just his methods were more ruthless.
But others, like Hugh Trevor Roper, strongly disagreed with that, didn't they?
Absolutely. Trevor Roper and many others believed Hitler always intended a major war, specifically to destroy communism and gain Lebensraum in Russia. They cite evidence from Mein Kampf and, crucially, the Hossbach Memorandum of November 1937. Those are notes from a pivotal secret meeting where Hitler privately outlined his aggressive expansionist plans to his military leadership. More recent interpretations, people like Neil Gregor and Adam Tooze, highlight how Hitler's aims went beyond traditional nationalism. They point towards a racial war of destruction. Tooze, in particular, suggests that economic pressures, a fear that Britain and France might rearm faster, plus Germany's shortages of raw materials, actually spurred Hitler to act sooner than maybe he'd originally planned.
Regardless of his precise long-term intentions, what's just undeniable is that Hitler achieved this almost unbroken series of brilliant successes by the end of 1938, largely without firing a single shot in a major war. How did he manage that?
It was a series of calculated steps, really, met with little effective resistance. He withdrew Germany from the World Disarmament Conference and the League of Nations in 1933, claiming France wouldn't agree to equal armaments. Then, in 1934, he signed that 10-year non-aggression pact with Poland. That was a significant diplomatic triumph for him. It undermined France's alliances and basically guaranteed Polish neutrality when he eventually moved against Austria and Czechoslovakia. After a brief setback in July 1934 with a failed Nazi revolt in Austria, which Mussolini swiftly thwarted, the Saar region was returned to Germany in January 1935 through a plebiscite, a legitimate vote.
And then came the first clear violation of Versailles, the one that really tested the waters.
Indeed. March 1935, he openly reintroduced conscription, building his army up to 36 divisions, a clear breach of the Versailles Treaty. Yet, despite the formation of the Stresa Front, that short-lived agreement between Britain, France, and Italy against German rearmament, no concrete action was taken. Nothing happened. Next, June 1935, Britain signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, an act that, without consulting France or Italy, essentially condoned German naval rearmament and, well, shattered what little trust remained within the Stresa Front.
And this pattern of just escalating boldness continued, didn't it?
Absolutely. March 1936, Hitler took the calculated risk of sending troops into the demilitarized Rhineland, a direct breach of both Versailles and Locarno treaties. He apparently even gave orders to withdraw at the first sign of French opposition. But no resistance was offered, just the usual protests. Later that year, he solidified his alliances, formed the Rome-Berlin Axis with Italy, the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan. Their joint intervention in the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939 also provided invaluable military experience for both Germany and Italy, including, infamously, the bombing of Guernica.
And the culmination of these successes really was the Anschluss with Austria in March 1938. That was a huge step.
It truly was Hitler's greatest success up to that point. Austrian Nazis staged demonstrations, and when Chancellor Schuschnigg called for a referendum on independence, Hitler just moved his troops in before the vote could even happen. Austria was annexed into the Third Reich. It was a triumph that really laid bare the weakness of Britain and France, who again just issued protests. It highlighted the value of his new understanding with Italy, and strategically, it severely crippled Czechoslovakia. Now they could be attacked from three sides: All this led directly into his campaign to secure the Sudetenland, ending in that triumph at Munich.
So given this string of successes, the crucial question emerges. How exactly was Hitler allowed to get away with all these violations without triggering a major war? Our source points to a single answer: appeasement.
Appeasement. Right. As defined by our source, it was the policy primarily adopted by the British and later by the French of seeking to avoid war with aggressive powers, Japan, Italy, Germany, by basically conceding to their demands, provided those demands weren't considered too unreasonable. This policy had two distinct phases, really. From the mid-20s until 1937, there was this general sort of underlying feeling that another war must be avoided at all costs, which led Britain and France to often tolerate various acts of aggression and breaches of treaties. Then, when Neville Chamberlain became British Prime Minister in May 1937, he gave appeasement a new, active drive. He genuinely believed in taking the initiative, aiming to understand Hitler's desires and show that reasonable claims could be met by negotiation rather than by force.
And from their perspective at the time, there were compelling justifications for this policy, weren't there? It wasn't just weakness.
Absolutely not, or at least not entirely. Foremost was the overwhelming fear of another devastating war, potentially even worse than the First World War. The horrific memories of trench warfare still haunted people, and the Spanish Civil War offered this chilling glimpse of the terrifying prospect of mass city bombings. Britain was still economically fragile from the Great Depression. They simply couldn't afford massive rearmament or the costs of major conflict. Plus, there was strong pacifist public opinion in Britain. Remember the Oxford Union vote in '33? Students declaring they wouldn't fight for king and country? And Baldwin's election promise of no great armaments helped him win in 1935.
So, a war-weary public, an economic slump. But was there also a belief that Germany maybe had legitimate grievances?
Yes, definitely. Many genuinely believed that Germany and Italy had genuine grievances, that Versailles had treated Germany too harshly, that Italy had been cheated out of territory after WWII. The thinking was, showing sympathy, revising these harsh clauses, might lead to lasting peace. Chamberlain himself personally believed in direct engagement with leaders. He thought he could control and civilize Hitler through negotiation. And for many British conservatives, there's also a significant fear of communist Russia. So they saw Hitler's Germany as a necessary buffer against Soviet expansion. Underlying all these factors, though, was the stark reality of British military unpreparedness for a war on potentially three fronts: Germany, Japan, and Italy simultaneously.
What's fascinating here is how profoundly appeasement affected the unfolding of international relations. You mentioned it was primarily a British policy, but France's agreement often came with considerable reluctance.
That's a crucial point. For instance, Louis Barthou, the French foreign minister in 1934, he advocated firmness against Hitler. He actively sought to build a strong anti-German alliance, even pushed for Russia's entry into the League of Nations. Tragically, he was assassinated in October 1934. His successor, Laval, signed a rather weak alliance with Russia, but placed his primary hopes on Mussolini. Hopes that were ultimately dashed by that Laval Pact debacle.
Ah, yes, that secret deal.
Exactly. That highly controversial attempt by British and French ministers to secretly hand over a large part of Abyssinia to Italy. After that, France, deeply divided internally, largely just fell in line behind the British. And we see appeasement at work in numerous instances from our source. The inaction against obvious German rearmament. Yet figures like Lord Lothian remarking after meeting Hitler in '35 that Hitler does not want war. What the Germans are after is a strong army which will enable them to deal with Russia. The Anglo-German naval agreement, the half-hearted British response to Abyssinia, the French inaction on the Rhineland remilitarization, despite it breaching both Versailles and Locarno. Lord Lothian dismissed it as Germans merely entering their own back garden. Then there was non-intervention in the Spanish Civil War and the mere protests at the Anschluss. Each of these instances, unfortunately, just allowed Hitler to push further and further.
The source describes the year between September 1938 and September 1939 as fateful, Hitler launching two intense pressure campaigns, first against Czechoslovakia and then against Poland. Why Czechoslovakia first?
Well, Hitler utterly detested their democracy, their Slavic identity, and the very fact that their state had been created by the hated Versailles settlement. Strategically, controlling Czechoslovakia would give Germany immense advantages, militarily and economically, dominating Central Europe. The Sudetenland crisis began with a propaganda campaign, alleging discrimination against the 3.5 million Sudeten Germans. Hitler stirred up disturbances, claiming they were being mistreated. Chamberlain and Daladier, terrified of war, put immense pressure on the Czechs to make concessions. President Benaya eventually agreed to hand over the Sudeten German areas. However, at a second meeting at Godesberg just a week later, Hitler escalated his demands, insisting on immediate entry for German troops. Benaya refused and mobilized the Czech army, and they actually had strong fortifications and an expanded force. Our source notes it would certainly not have been a walkover for the Germans.
But war was avoided, temporarily. Hitler invited Britain, France, and Italy to the Munich Conference in September 1938. The outcome there, a plan supposedly for Mussolini but actually drafted by the German Foreign Office, was accepted. The Sudetenland would be immediately ceded to Germany. Poland and Hungary also gained territory. Crucially, neither the Czechs nor the Russians were invited to decide Czechoslovakia's fate. France, despite its guarantee, essentially abandoned its ally. The Czechs had no choice but to accept. The morning after, Chamberlain signed that scrap of paper with Hitler, promising to renounce warlike intentions. When he returned to Britain, waving the paper, he got this rapturous welcome from a public desperate for peace, famously declaring, "I believe it is peace for our time." But not everyone was convinced, were they? Churchill famously called Munich a total and unmitigated defeat. Duff Cooper, the first Lord of the Admiralty, resigned, saying Hitler couldn't be trusted. This raises an important question for you, the listener. How do you think the average person in Britain felt at this moment, caught between that desperate hope for peace and the dire warnings of people like Churchill?
And, tragically, that skepticism proved entirely well-founded. The final destruction of Czechoslovakia in March 1939 confirmed it. Crippled by the loss of, 70% of its heavy industry, a third of its population and territory, almost all its border fortifications, Czechoslovakia was left utterly vulnerable. German-encouraged Slovak demands for independence provided the pretext. Hitler pressured the Slovak Prime Minister, Tiso, and ultimately Czech President Hacha was literally forced, to agree to German occupation under the direct threat of Prague being bombed. On March 15, 1939, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, and for the first time, even the most ardent appeasers couldn't justify what Hitler had done. He had blatantly broken his promise and seized purely non-German territory. This act, finally, decisively hardened Chamberlain's attitude.
With Czechoslovakia gone, Hitler swiftly turned his attention to Poland, first annexing the Lithuanian port of Memel. His demands on Poland were for the return of Danzig and a road and railway across the Polish corridor. These demands were actually, as the source notes, not unreasonable, given Danzig's German majority. But coming so soon after Czechoslovakia, the Poles rightly feared it was simply a prelude to full invasion. Despite British promises of help, Poland refused the demands. Then came the bombshell, the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact in August 1939, which included a secret agreement to divide Poland up between Germany and the USSR. Hitler was convinced that with Russia neutral, Britain and France would not risk intervention.
And the Anglo-French efforts to secure an alliance with Russia, which was really the only way to make their promise to Poland truly effective, they stalled. Partly due to British reluctance, deep distrust of the Soviets. Hitler exploited this delay. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Britain and France, after a brief delay where Chamberlain still sought a German withdrawal, finally delivered their ultimatums. Hitler didn't even bother to reply. When the ultimatums expired, Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. The Second World War had officially begun.
So, as we wrap up this incredibly complex period, the question remains, and it's one historians fiercely debate. Who or what was ultimately responsible for the Second World War? Our source makes it clear that initial criticisms often pointed to the Versailles treaties, fueling German bitterness, the failure of the League of Nations and collective security, the world economic crisis contributing to Hitler's rise. But it's worth noting, as the source does, that by the end of 1938, most of Germany's specific grievances, reparations, disarmament clauses, Rhineland, Austria, Sudeten Germans, had in fact been addressed. Germany was a great power again. So where did it go wrong from there?
Right. Let's consider some of the main arguments. Some historians, like Alan Bullock, argue that the appeasers bear significant blame. By constantly giving way, they encouraged Hitler's aggression, boosted his prestige, maybe led him to believe Britain and France would just stay passive. It tempted him to gamble on war with Poland. There's even a critique, isn't there, that Chamberlain chose the wrong issue, militarily weaker Poland, over potentially stronger Czechoslovakia to finally make a stand. However, defenders of appeasement, people like John Charmley, argue it gained a crucial year for Britain to rearm, a vital period for their military buildup. Robert Self suggests Chamberlain had very few viable alternatives given the circumstances. And Richard Overy points out that Britain and France also acted out of national self-interest, primarily seeking to preserve their own power and economic stability. It wasn't pure altruism or pure cowardice.
And then there's the controversial role of the USSR. They're often accused of making war inevitable by signing that non-aggression pact with Germany, especially with its secret clauses to partition Poland. The argument being, if Stalin had allied with the West in Poland, it might have deterred Hitler.
Well, on the flip side, Soviet historians and others justify the pact as gaining crucial time for the USSR to prepare its defenses against what they saw as an inevitable German attack later on. And it's also true that the British were highly reluctant to form an alliance with the Russians. Deep-seated distrust of communists played a role. And the Poles, too, are strongly opposed to having Soviet troops on their soil, understandably perhaps.
But the most central debate, of course, revolves around Hitler himself. The generally accepted view, I think it's fair to say, is that Hitler was overwhelmingly to blame. Historians like Martin Gilbert argue Hitler's underlying motive was erasing the stigma of WWII defeat, believing the only antidote to defeat in one war is victory in the next. Hugh Trevor Roper and many others believe Hitler intended a major war right from the beginning, fueled by his hatred of communism, his desire to destroy Russia for Lebensraum, viewing Poland as just a necessary preliminary step. This blueprint theory is supported by Mein Kampf, the Hossbach Memorandum. If this is correct, appeasement merely made things easier for Hitler. War was basically inevitable anyway.
Yeah, and what's particularly striking is the consensus today, as noted by German historian Eberhard Jäckel. The view is that Hitler's ultimate goal was indeed establishing a greater Germany through conquest, primarily at the expense of Soviet Russia, leading to a racial war of destruction. He seemed to believe it would be an easy military victory over what he saw as disorganized Jewish Bolsheviks and incompetent Slavs. However, this doesn't necessarily mean he meticulously planned a global war involving Britain and France from day one. Alan Bullock and Richard Overy, for instance, suggest Hitler didn't explicitly seek war with Britain and France. He hoped they wouldn't interfere with his Eastern European expansion. He hoped they'd let him defeat Poland and the USSR in separate campaigns.
But how do we reconcile all this with A.J.P. Taylor's controversial view? He argued Hitler didn't intend a major war, expected at most a short conflict with Poland, and that he was just this brilliant opportunist taking advantage of the appeaser's mistakes. Taylor even went so far as to suggest the war was a mistake, the result on both sides of diplomatic blunders, almost as if Hitler stumbled into it. While criticized for maybe whitewashing Hitler, Taylor still firmly placed blame on Hitler and the German people for their aggression, famously stating Hitler was the creation of German history.
Right. Recent historians tend to downplay Taylor's continuity theory, though. They emphasize how Hitler's aims went far beyond traditional German nationalism to this truly radical, destructive racial war, as Neil Gregor points out. And Adam Tooze's theory adds another crucial piece. Hitler, Tooze argues, risked war in September 1939 because he feared the longer he delayed, the more likely Britain and France would overtake German rearmament. Despite massive investment, Germany was facing shortages of raw materials, foreign exchange issues. His rearmament pace wasn't sustainable long term. He felt he had to act sooner rather than later before his military advantage began to fade. A window of opportunity he felt was closing.
Ultimately, Ian Kershaw, Hitler's recent biographer, seems to summarize the prevailing view. He sees no reason to change the general conclusion that Hitler must take the blame. For Hitler, war was simply inevitable, and maybe only the precise timing and direction were truly at issue. We've just navigated a really complex, often harrowing period where international relations frayed under the weight of aggressive expansion and hesitant, often insufficient responses. What really stands out to you from this deep dive into how the world stumbled into global conflict?
Well, for me, it really highlights the immense fragility of peace when a determined aggressor faces powers that are either unwilling or perhaps unable to act decisively. And this raises an important question for all of us, really. When is compromise a genuine path to peace? And when is it merely emboldening further aggression? It's a tough balance.
A very tough balance indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope this exploration of Norman Lowe's work has offered you a clearer understanding of how the world moved from fragile peace to devastating war. Perhaps it prompts you to consider what lessons from this period might still resonate in today's world regarding that delicate balance between diplomacy and deterrence.